In the nation's capital, a project that the U.S. General Services Administration describes as the largest construction project in the Washington metropolitan area since the construction of the Pentagon is in progress. The construction of the 4.5 million square working feet of the new Department of Homeland Security headquarters offers a unique challenge for the GSA because the location of that construction, the St. Elizabeth campus, is a National Historic Landmark. The former St. Elizabeth's Hospital, once called the Government Hospital for the Insane, is representative of more than 70 such campuses made up of massive, ornate Victorian buildings designed by some of the most preeminent architects of their time, built across the United States over a 65-year period. Today, their decaying forms represent ghosts of an era, part of a vision that for some became a nightmare. The buildings of the Kirkbride Plan deserve to be remembered. The idea for Kirkbride Plan hospitals originated with the Age of Enlightenment, a movement in 17th and 18th century Europe that sought to replace many religious and supernatural beliefs with scientific study. Throughout much of human history, mental illness had been viewed as a religious problem, often perceived and treated as a sort of demonic possession. In a post entitled The Surprising History of Mental Illness Treatment, Baton Rouge Behavioral Hospital explains that treatment for demonic possessions almost appeared as torture. Exorcisms, malnutrition, and inappropriate medications all appeared as treatment methods for people with mental illness. While asylums were slowly established, their primary purpose was to keep the mentally ill, who were seen essentially as wild animals, not morally responsible for their actions, out of the public eye. Even though some institutions, commonly called madhouses, advertised humane conditions, treatments might include bloodletting, electrical shock, beatings, starvation, and the use of irritant chemicals. Treatment and neglect were even worse for people who were unable to pay, called pauper lunatics, often institutionalized at the expense of a local parish, and who were often shackled in filthy, cold conditions. The Enlightenment, however, spurred a movement for reform in the treatment of mental illness that developed over the latter part of the 18th century and came to the fore during the 19th. Moral treatment was partially the result of moral objection to the often brutal treatment of the insane and the clinical belief that insanity could be cured via moral means, emphasizing social interaction. Moral treatment led to many reforms across Europe, from bans on the use of chains as a restraint for mental patients to regulating the sanitary conditions of private madhouses. But the system itself depended upon asylums. The Journal of the Illinois State Historical Society explains, moral treatment consisted of moving mentally ill persons from a stressful environment and family conflicts and placing them under a rather benign but autocratic system of organized living. The development of systems of state-supported asylums spread across Europe. Two early examples in the United States were Pennsylvania Hospital and Virginia's Eastern State Hospital. In 1750, Dr. Thomas Bond, with the help of a friend, Benjamin Franklin, established the Pennsylvania Hospital, securing the assistance of the Pennsylvania Assembly to match funds raised by the public. The purpose of the hospital was, Bond argued, to take care of the sick, poor, and insane who were wandering the streets of Philadelphia. Pennsylvania Hospital still operates today as part of the University of Pennsylvania Health System and is described as America's first hospital. Notably, the hospital devoted space to the mentally ill, although initially lunatics were confined to the basement. Virginia chartered Eastern State Hospital in 1773, the first public facility in the United States constructed solely for the care and treatment of the mentally ill. But these state-supported hospitals were uncommon in the U.S. even at the turn of the 19th century. Throughout most of the country, the insane were often kept in county jails or almshouses, the basements of public buildings, or contracted to be kept in private homes. Conditions were most often deplorable. If there was treatment at all, it was often inhumane, and they were often housed with violent criminals. Social reformer Dorothea Dix, a resident of Boston who had been impressed by systems she had seen while traveling in Europe, visited many of the prisons and almshouses in the Boston area, and in 1843 wrote a report to the Massachusetts legislature on the condition in which idiots and insane persons were dwelling in circumstances not only adverse to their own physical and moral improvement, but productive of extreme disadvantages to all other persons brought into association with them. I come as the advocate of helpless, forgotten, insane, and idiotic men and women, of beings sunk to a condition from which the most unconcerned would start with real horror, of beings wretched in our prisons, and more wretched in our almshouses. Her report resulted in the passage of a bill to create a state-funded asylum. She then began lobbying other state legislatures, spurring a wave of construction of state asylums for the insane. In 1844, she testified before the New Jersey state legislature. The testimony resulted in the 1848 construction of the first public mental hospital in the state of New Jersey, the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum in Trenton. The building would be the first designed on the principles formulated by physician Thomas Story Kirkbride. Born to a wealthy Quaker family in Pennsylvania in 1809, Kirkbride received a medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania in 1832. By the 1830s, the insane wards at the Pennsylvania Hospital had become overcrowded, and hospital managers decided to construct a separate asylum. Opened in 1841, Kirkbride was made the first director of the Pennsylvania Asylum for the Insane. His development of treatments for the mentally ill would lead to the hospital being commonly called Kirkbride's Hospital. His development of therapies for the treatment of insanity was significant. He's credited as a founder of the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane, a precursor to today's American Psychiatric Association. Among his developments was a plan for the construction of asylums that he believed promoted care and recovery. Kirkbride believed that exposure to fresh air and natural sunlight were integral to recovery from psychiatric illness. Those needs dictated the general structure of the massive institutional structures that came to be known as Kirkbride Hospitals, or just Kirkbrides. The Village Voice wrote in 2016, "His buildings ushered in a new era of mental health treatment, which had until then consisted mostly of imprisoning and abusing the mentally ill. For his patients, Kirkbride prescribed natural and architectural beauty, combined with the powers of fresh air, sunlight, and exercise. In keeping with that philosophy, Kirkbrides, while having numerous architectural styles, had a common form, resembling a bat wing. A central building housing the hospital administration, kitchens, and public areas would have wings extending both directions. But instead of straight lines, the wings would be staggered, allowing each hallway to have natural light and ventilation at both ends. The various wards would allow the hospital to segregate the patients, with separate wards for men and women, and for patients with different conditions. The hospital in Trenton that Dorothea Dix had helped establish was the first built using the Kirkbride Plan. The building itself was designed by renowned Scottish-born architect John Notman, credited with introducing the Italianate style to America. Opened on May 15, 1848, the website World Abandoned notes the influence of the new design. The hospital's first superintendent was Dr. Horace A. Buttolph, and 86 patients were admitted in the first year. As the first building designed under the Kirkbride Plan, it was subject to visits from doctors and psychiatrists from around the United States and even beyond. The hospital and its patients were under scrutiny as the effects of Thomas Story Kirkbride's theories were analyzed. It was deemed to be a resounding success. In 1847, Dix had convinced the Illinois legislature to fund a state asylum, and the Kirkbride Plan was selected. The construction of the Illinois State Asylum and Hospital for the Insane began in 1848, and the building was open for patients in 1851. The Pennsylvania State Lunatic Hospital in Harrisburg, built on the Kirkbride Plan and designed by noted Philadelphia architect John Haviland in the classical revival style, was completed the same year. The State Lunatic Hospital at Taunton, Massachusetts, designed by prominent Worcester architect Elbridge Boyden, was completed in 1854. That year, with successes mounting, Kirkbride published his influential work on the construction, organization, and general arrangements of hospitals for the insane. He argued in the book's foreword, "The universal experience is that a large majority of all such cases of insanity can be treated most successfully among strangers, and very generally only in institutions specially provided for the management of this class of diseases." He was optimistic about the efficacy of his design. Of the recent cases of insanity, properly treated, between 80 and 90% can recover. Of those neglected or improperly managed, very few get well, he opined. Kirkbrides were massive, imposing structures. The Jacksonville, Illinois hospital was 5.5 stories. As with the Kirkbrides already built, many were designed by renowned architects. Kirkbride wrote, "Although it is not desirable to have an elaborate or costly style of architecture, it is nevertheless really important that the building should be in good taste, and that it should impress favorably not only the patients, but their friends and others who may visit it. Importantly," he said, "a hospital for the insane should have a cheerful and comfortable appearance. Everything repulsive and prison-like should be carefully avoided." Photographer Ethan McElroy explains that careful attention was given to every detail of the design to promote a healthy environment and convey a sense of respectable decorum. Placed in secluded areas within expansive grounds, many of these insane asylums seemed almost palace-like from the outside. Kirkbride paid careful attention to the grounds, writing that the building should be in a healthful, pleasant, and fertile district of the country. The land chosen should be of good quality and easily tilled. The surrounding scenery should be of varied and attractive kind, and the neighborhood should possess numerous objects of an agreeable and interesting character. His book would inspire the construction of dozens more Kirkbrides over the rest of the 19th century, but one, the Government Hospital for the Insane, was already under construction. The hospital was the result of an 1852 appropriation by Congress for a hospital to provide care for indigent residents of the District of Columbia and members of the U.S. Army and Navy with brain illnesses. The hospital deviated from Kirkbride's design in the inclusion of 2 additional buildings for housing male and female African-American patients. Completed in October 1855, the hospital was used by the Army and Navy during the Civil War, and the name St. Elizabeth's, the name that the tract of land on which the hospital had been built had been used since colonial times, was used to differentiate the Army Hospital from the Insane Asylum. The Army Hospital closed after the war, but the name St. Elizabeth's continued to be used. The location of St. Elizabeth's resulted in several famous patients. In 1832, Richard Lawrence, an English-born house painter, started exhibiting signs of mental illness that continued to escalate. In January 1835, that illness manifested itself in the first attempt to assassinate a U.S. president. Stepping out from behind a pillar, Lawrence attempted to shoot President Andrew Jackson. Lawrence used 2 pistols, but both misfired, likely a result of the rainy weather. Angry, the 68-year-old president beat Lawrence with a cane until Congressman Davy Crockett wrestled the would-be assassin to the ground. Lawrence was prosecuted by Francis Scott Key, author of the Star-Spangled Banner, but owing to strange outbursts in court was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He spent the rest of his life in mental asylums, including St. Elizabeth's, where he was housed from 1855 until his death in 1861. 20 years later, on July 2, 1881, unhinged lawyer Charles Guiteau shot President James Garfield. Garfield died 11 weeks later of infection, and Guiteau was tried for murder. During his trial, he was housed at St. Elizabeth's. Despite obvious signs of insanity, the jury was in no mood for a not guilty verdict. Guiteau was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. He continued to stay at St. Elizabeth's until the day of his execution, June 30th, 1882. As a sign of the longevity of the Kirkbride at St. Elizabeth's, the facility would see another presidential assassin housed there. On March 30th, 1981, nearly a century after Guiteau's attempt, 26-year-old John Hinckley Jr. shot President Ronald Reagan and 3 other men in an attempt to gain the attention of actress Jodie Foster. Found not guilty by reason of insanity, Hinckley spent the next 34 years in St. Elizabeth's, where he said in a 1983 interview, see a therapist, answer mail, play guitar, listen to music, play pool, watch television, eat lousy food, and take delicious medication. Outrage over the verdict spurred the 1984 Insanity Defense Reform Act, making it much more difficult to obtain a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity in federal court. He was released in 2013. In all, 73 Kirkbrides were built in the United States, with the last opening in 1913. Hospitals of the Kirkbride design were also built in New South Wales, Australia, and Halifax, Nova Scotia. But despite the longevity of many of the Kirkbride buildings, they never lived up to their promise. In practice, Kirkbride's assumptions about the curability of mental illness demonstrated little evidence of success, and almost from the start the hospitals were underfunded and overcrowded. Despite his ideals, many Kirkbrides ended up betraying Kirkbride's basic principles. The Illinois Times write, lack of funds during the Great Depression and World War II, as well as swelling of patient populations in state hospitals, which strained staffs, led to cramped, filthy environments. Restraint devices, which were hotly debated in the early days of Illinois mental health system, became commonplace. The Village Voice notes many of the Kirkbride asylums became overcrowded dens of mistreatment and neglect. Despite Kirkbride's lofty goals, some of the hospitals developed terrible reputations. The Jacksonville, Illinois asylum gained notoriety when Elizabeth Packard was institutionalized against her will, the victim of a state law that allowed husbands to confine their wives to an asylum without a hearing. Finally winning her release, she formed the Anti-Insane Asylum Society. In 1907, Dr. Henry Cotton became the medical director at what was then named the New Jersey State Hospital at Trenton, which had been the first Kirkbride. While he made reforms such as banning the use of restraints, the website Random Times notes that, believing that infections were the key to mental illness, he had his staff remove teeth and various other body parts that might become infected from the hospital patients, resulting in a legacy of hundreds of fatalities and thousands of maimed and mutilated patients. Random Times referred to the hospital as the madhouse of horrors. St. Elizabeth's in Washington, D.C. pioneered attempts to use electroconversive therapy to convert homosexuals to heterosexuality, became notorious for the repression of the LGBTQ community. Underfunded, many of these massive buildings fell into disrepair, and they fell victim to the trend of deinstitutionalization, which began in the 1940s. A few, including Trenton Psychiatric Hospital and the East Campus of St. Elizabeth's, still house a few patients, but many more have been demolished over the last few decades. Many remain derelict, where they are popular destinations for ghost hunters. McElroy says of them, they loom on the outskirts of towns across the United States. Their imposing facades mask inspirational stories of recovery and horrific accounts of abuse. Despite their checkered history, the buildings retain historic significance, and more than 30 are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. That leaves a challenge for the remaining buildings. Some, like St. Elizabeth's West Campus, are being repurposed as the GSA works to preserve the historic nature of the campus while serving a modern purpose. The Village Voice quotes Robert Kirkbride, who is the dean of the Parsons School of Constructed Environments at the New School and a descendant of Thomas Story Kirkbride, that the stigma attached to the buildings is separate from the buildings themselves. But the Village Voice notes that if communities want to repurpose the buildings, they will have to reckon with the taint of the building's unique history, come up with ways to honor, or at least acknowledge, the former residents. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguideguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.